see almost no mention of looking at trees as part of the issue in terms of trying to deal with climate impacts such as heat island effect, dealing with asthma, other things in terms of the benefits that trees provide in neighborhoods. I would just put that out as a comment to say, be aware of that. As you mentioned, Sandra Pinna Debater is a very good person to talk to and relate to that. But in terms of the work you do, I think you really need to look at the Urban Forestry Commission as one of the entities that should be involved much more in that process, because they've not been consulted, they're not involved in production of that study that the city did.
Okay.
This is for Craig. It seems like you're caught between a rock and a hard place when it comes to the LNG facility in Tacoma, because on one hand, you're charged to reduce particulates, and on the other hand, you're charged to worry about greenhouse gases. And it seems to me the bigger problem is the greenhouse gases. That if you approve this facility, you're locking it into 40 years of however many greenhouse gases are coming out of the facility versus waiting for some other technology to reduce particulates coming off of ships. So what are your thoughts on that?
So I can make this the world's shortest answer to a question. We are right in the middle of analyzing all the comments we got, including comments similar to what you just said in the supplemental environmental impact statement, which I expect to be done with, I hope, around the end of March. So because we're in the middle of that process, I'm just not going to comment on that particular question right now, because we have to release the report that addresses comments like that and several thousand others.
I have a question about electric cars versus hybrid cars. There's a lot of hybrid cars. My car's a Prius. And is there going to be a push to get us out of our cars into straight electric at some point? And when would that be?
Thank you for driving this. And I think what we're trying to do is provide opportunities through things like the EV readiness ordinance. You know, there's not a requirement to get you out of a Prius. I think we're trying to overall ensure that the city is ready for people voluntarily getting into hybrid vehicles, be they buses, be they when you switch over from a hybrid to a plug-in vehicle. Maybe that's something you're not doing right now because the models aren't available at the cost that you want them to be, or maybe it's because you don't have the ability to plug in at home or at work. So what we're trying to do is ensure we're seeing an uptick, we're seeing the market be such that more and more people are voluntarily getting into electric vehicles of one sort or another. So we're trying to make sure that folks are ready for that. From a climate impact, the hybrid aspect of it, the car still consumes gas. So certainly our desire is to get as many people into all electric as possible, especially because we've got that super clean grid from Seattle City Light. And we are seeing a voluntary uptick in EV registrations. It's going through the roof. I saw it happen down in California, and so we want to assure that people don't experience range anxiety in their passenger vehicles, that they have the ability to charge in multiple locations. Seattle City Light's committed to get 20 charging stations in Seattle in this year, in part so people will have multiple options. And again, that's what the EV readiness ordinance is about as well.
You raised a good point about the price point, because as we've read about Tesla's announcing that 35K Tesla, it's still pretty expensive. But just recently, Volkswagen has announced a 25K smaller four-door vehicle, which brings it down into the price range to be very competitive with any hybrid you look at, albeit a smaller car. Things are changing fast. And so you won't have to wait long.
I want to have some feedback on again, indoor environments. One of our family's best experiences, it's years ago now, but was an extended afternoon up in BC in Queen Elizabeth Park and the big conservatory up there. And am I imagining, or was the air cleaner in a big conservatory like that because of all the plants? And if it was cleaner, is that a direction that parks in the city could lead in? In other words, could we be looking at refuges just like we put people, in a higher ground area if there's flooding? Could we be focusing on building more greenhouses around the city as refuge zones, and encouraging live plants in school auditoriums, places where it might be possible to build in some of the relief, if you will, for bad air?
It's a really interesting question. I'm going to defer to Tim and Craig on the science before that, rather than policy.
So, one thing I want to say about this is we should always be striving to get the cleanest air possible, because I don't want us to move towards a world where we think we can simply get out of this, right? So you can probably not necessarily guess, but I'm a distance runner, and during last summer my phone blew up from texts from coaches of, should I tell my athletes not to run outside, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we want to live in the world where we can be outdoors. That said, one of the conversations that we unfortunately are probably going to have is what refuge can we provide during incidents like last summer, because the health effects of particulate matter, even getting people some kind of a break from the constant inflammation, even if it's a few hours, could be significant. Now, does that mean something like that? Not necessarily. So here's an example that I think we're going to have a regional conversation about. Our library system. Are we going to have to get to the point where we work with the regional libraries and the Seattle libraries so that unsheltered people, for example, who don't have any air conditioning or can't shut up in a home to reduce that particulate, could go into a library that extends its hours for a couple hours at night and a couple hours in the morning, and that people who can't get out of that have some way to do that? So I think that does need to be part of the conversation, because again, a few hours of that avoidance could actually be helpful from a health standpoint for people exposed to that high level of particulate. That said, the filtration effect of that is probably, and I'll let Tim jump in here, from my less scientific than him background, the filtration effect of an existing structure's use hours being extended is probably more efficient than trying to build new structures that don't necessarily have all that filtration. So in other words, taking advantage of the existing infrastructure should probably be the first stop in that conversation.
Yeah, the other broader perspective here, and I give a nod to the urban forestry folks, is that there's been a lot of research on PM 2.5. You can imagine, believe me, they've looked at every way possible to kick the can and it doesn't go away. But now, an emerging area, another very active emerging area of research is the green space, in which they've taken the PM 2.5 data and they've looked at the effect of green space and PM 2.5 and other things, and they find that green space has an independent effect on things like mortality and cardiorespiratory diseases alone from just the pollution levels. Now you imagine that in big green spaces there'd be lower pollution levels, but given the fact, so it's a very active area of research. There's a lot of speculation as to why, and stress and other things, but it's a very interesting concept in terms of mitigation and outdoor effects as well.
Does that count green painted concrete?
So I'll comment on that. So I'm the air pollution guy, right? But one of the things we have to look at is cumulative stressors for people. So Tim and I were talking about this beforehand, about when we're looking at scientific studies, trying to take out the effect of noise pollution for people living near major roadways and focusing on the air pollution component of it. In answer to your question, and this is anecdotal, there was some work done once upon a time in hospital rooms about whether someone's room had a view of a tree or had a view of a wall. And that showed that people who had the view of the tree had faster recovery times. So there's absolutely emerging science on the health effects of being able to access green spaces. The anecdote is I was told that someone who heard this painted green leaves on a wall that their relative could see from the hospital bed in an attempt to simulate, and that's one example. So the answer is maybe, that maybe having, even if it wasn't a real tree, having that green. But Tim's right, this is absolutely an emerging field about the benefits of green space.
But it doesn't include the boiler that was, coal boiler that was put out of commission in Tasmania, a talk I went to yesterday, that had a tree growing on it.
I'd like to see a picture of that.
So I have two quick questions. One, why are we waiting until 2030 to implement higher standards on commercial and multifamily developers?
Great question. I think in part because we need to have time for developers to, in terms of the planning cycle, you need to have time for folks to get ready and adapt to those standards. That's basically.
I think they could adapt faster if we demanded it. But
Uh-huh.
the other question is, you want us to move as much as possible to electric. I agree with that, but we're paying higher electric rates because we didn't charge developers impact fees, and we're paying for substation improvements. So why aren't we having developers pay it so that the electric rates stay down for the residents of Seattle and we use electric more?
And again, I will give you a card and attempt to
Okay.
find the right person at Seattle City Light who sets rate policy to answer that particular question. I'm going to try not to invoke the "been here for 16 weeks" rule too often
Okay.
because I don't want to sound like I'm copping out, but I will attempt to get you in touch with the person who can answer that question.
Okay.
Thank you. If Paige would scroll back 3 or 4 pages in the display, if you all can help reconcile the numbers, a couple more to the mayor's performance standards, the one after, yes, okay.
This one?
If you can help me reconcile the numbers, the reductions have been promised since 2008. The mayor targets codes by 2030, as a previous questioner. The consensus of the world scientists is that we need to be near having fully transitioned by 2030. How do we reconcile these?
Fully transitioned to, I'm sorry, which, they need to be fully transitioned to what?
The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has 5-year reports.
Yep.
An interim report was released, I think, last summer, that we have approximately 10 to 12 years to fully transition away from fossil fuels in order to avoid the most catastrophic outcomes.
Right.
This is a consensus conservative estimate. The American governmental agencies produced another report in around October, which was confirming this. Then in Nature magazine, a report on ocean heat content documented that we had underestimated the heat absorption by the world's oceans by about 25%. 80% of the planetary warming is taken up by the Earth's oceans. This report was excoriated. A few months later, in November, in Science magazine, an independent analysis corroborated the estimate of the ocean heat content, which at the bottom line is we need to have very nearly fully transitioned away from fossil fuels, done by 2030-32. How do we reconcile these numbers?
Some of these I think, are policy questions that you guys aren't in charge of. But
No, but I think it's a fair question. I've been in this field my entire career, and I am alarmed by the numbers we're seeing. This is something I'm very concerned about. It's a global problem. I think in terms of our position in the world and Seattle's position in the world, 90% of the population, I believe it's either 80% or 90% of the population in the very near future of the entire planet is going to be based in cities. We have an opportunity and a responsibility to lead on it. People who live in cities have a lower per capita carbon footprint. So in many ways, there's an opportunity. It does lead to more growth in urban areas, and it's also an opportunity to reduce everybody's footprint. We have here in Seattle one of the cleanest grids possible. One of the reasons why we're saying electrify everything is because Seattle City Light has had a commitment to carbon neutrality for the past, I think it was in 2008, it might have been a little bit earlier than that. So that's why a big part of our initiative, because we have this unique asset in the city, is to electrify everything. And also, at the same time, through a variety of initiatives, by virtue of living in Seattle, you've got a lighter footprint than a lot of folks, including folks who live in less urban areas. So we're trying to solve this planet problem not just for Seattle, but for the entire planet. We're trying to take care of that. In terms of a transition off of fossil fuels, we're trying to work that from a variety of different policy angles, including encouraging and accelerating fleet electrification, and getting people from oil heated houses into heat pump heated houses. That's just one example of that. So do we need to be moving faster? Absolutely, and we're trying to accelerate through multiple fronts, basically.
I can address this for a second, even though yes, it's a policy question. So, because I deal with the legislature a lot on this. So, the policymakers have a whole bunch of choices to make, and on the speed of emission reductions, one of the things that they look at is where is the world shifting already and where is it not shifting fast enough. So as an example, the coal plant market, so to speak, has been plummeting. Coal plants are closing across the United States. The uptake in India has slowed, and in China, because of several factors, including that natural gas has become cheaper and renewables are now becoming cheaper than even existing coal plants, building new renewables. So policymakers have judgments to make of, is the market driving the necessary change on something like power generation? So where do they put their effort in? On the one hand, you can put your effort into 100% renewable and say we want to have this done by X date, but are you squeezing out the last 8%? Transportation, though, we are not succeeding fast enough on reducing emissions. So you asked the question earlier about, are we coming for your hybrid, so to speak? Well, the average Washingtonian keeps their car 12 years. So if we really want to have, and we don't have to be all the way, by the way, at 2030, what the science reports are, we have to be far enough on the pathway in 2030 to be to net zero in 2050 to have a hope of sticking to Paris. And the major concern of the scientists is, if you don't do this a lot now between now and 2030, you can't possibly get the last part from 2030 to 2050. So no one's coming from your hybrid today, but the choice, again, back to what investments we're willing to make is, are we all willing to say, okay, I've bought the last gas-powered car I'm ever going to buy, because that car is going to be there until 2030. So policymakers balance all of those factors. In effect, they're crystal balling to see where's the world going, where's the market going on things like electric generation, and then they're deciding when they want to intervene and say the market forces are failing us on things like climate change. But the reality is we're shifting from a world where a lot of companies making choices like electric generation is becoming a smaller slice of the emission pie because of those factors I talked about, and it's becoming more our choices about how we move around, to Chris's point, how we heat our homes, that is going to be a more critical slice in whether we're going to get to those reductions you're talking about.
Okay, we're coming to the end of our meeting, and I see one person who hasn't asked a question yet, so I'm going to give him the chance. We generally let our speakers know that they can leave at 11:30. I don't know if any of you can stick around longer and have individuals talk to you.
Happy to do that.
Okay, go.
So a couple questions for Chris's slides. The first one real simple, that one where you had all of the energy sectors and buildings and are kind of tiny, and then transportation consumption is big. Does the buildings number include not just lighting and space heating and such, but also plug loads and, say, the production of Portland cement? Is that included in that 20% building energy number?
The embodied energy is not currently included. That's one of the things that the
I didn't mean that.
Okay. You mean Portland
The-
cement?
The production of it.
That is included in industrial, if the Portland, if it's.
Is that in building energy?
That's not in building energy.
So that's in addition to all this?
Yes, that's the 5.7 million metric tons in the industrial, the expanded carbon footprint here. Expanded industry includes Port of Seattle Airport and industrial sector. So we recognize that as being a flaw, because if the cement is being manufactured outside of the city of Seattle and brought in for construction purposes, that's one of the reasons why we're part of the embodied carbon working group, is because we want to make sure that we're looking at the entire footprint. We're looking at what options are for the materials that you build things out of, and how do you reduce that, and making sure we're taking those into account. It's measured the way it is so we can compare apples to apples, so we can compare how we're doing compared to 1990, so we can compare ourselves to other cities in other regions. But we recognize there are additional things that we need to be looking at.
That's carbon pollution that we're looking at right there, is that correct?
Greenhouse gas,
Greenhouse
CO2.
gas.
So
The other number with the clouds and such, that's strictly energy consumption, right?
not strictly, like, it includes other things as well. There are other GHGs that are taken into account in this. If you'd like to do a deep dive, there's the inventory is online, and either myself or Ani Krishnan, who put the numbers together, can get into the methodology for you if you're really interested. But we try to take not just CO2, not just energy consumption, but other factors, direct emissions into account as well.
And the other question was about the slide that we were lingering on there for a while.
Mm-hmm.
The two bullets, one about 2030 that has a lot of us kind of wondering it's further into, later.
Right. Yep. That one?
That one.
That one.
Performance standards. So the Seattle's energy code and model energy codes around the country they go through a 3-year cycle, and each issue gets tighter and tighter for energy performance of a building. And Seattle's is like several steps ahead of model codes throughout the country. People turn to what is happening here because of our energy code. It breaks people's backs who come from other. They're like blown away what we require. We look at, you have to assess thermal bridging, things that people didn't even think existed 20 years ago in the design of a building. So what does that have to do with performance standards? Is this strictly about greenhouse? Yeah, because those are getting stricter all the time, but this makes it sound like, we're not doing anything until 2030.
Yeah, that's not the case. I think what we're in the process of doing right now, Sandra Mallory, who's on my team, she's a really brilliant architect. They're working on building performance, like what are the specifics of those building performance standards, and looking at a variety of factors. I keep coming back to embodied carbon because that's one of the ones that's front of mind right now, but what are the different aspects of the building performance standard requirements? We're actually working in partnership with 3 other cities who are trying to figure out their own building performance standards to figure out what's the best practice around this. Another reason why it's 2030, to your point, we already have a very aggressive code, and as we're setting this new building performance standard for 2030, we want to make sure we get it right. We want to make sure we're using the most recent information that we have to drive this and figure out what are the performance standards that make sense. How do we encourage folks to get off of fossil fuels? One of the ironic things when you accelerate policy, and it's a delicate balance, of course we want to do things faster and faster. Sometimes the technology needs time to catch up. If you had a requirement, for example, we don't, to get people off of, out of oil heat, if the heat pump technology isn't cheap enough or isn't at a certain stage, people will more likely go to natural gas heating, move from oil heating to natural gas heating. We would prefer it if they leapfrogged over oil heating into heat pumps. And that technology is just becoming available now at a price point that most people can afford. So that's a delicate balance that you strike when you're setting new policy, when you already have really aggressive codes, making sure you can do it early enough to help us meet our carbon goals, but at far out enough that people are making the technological choices that you want, and you're incorporating the most recent science on it. So that's what we're working on right now with the building performance standards. It's a chunk of time with 3 folks on my team this year is to really figure out about making the rules incentives, get them right. And so they're having conversations about that right now.
And do you benchmark then every 3 years? Can you integrate those benchmarks as you go to 2030?
Commercial buildings are required to benchmark every year. We get it from large commercial buildings in Seattle. They send us information, which you can see there's a website for that I can send you the link to, every year. Every 5 years, starting March, they're required to go through something called building tune-ups. So the first cohort is reporting
Can you
that.
change the standards as you go up until that 2030 point? I mean, that's what I'm asking. Are there ways in which you can calibrate based on the advances that you see in the availability? Or are you having to wait until that end goal to have the expectations?
I see what you're saying. So we can get more detail into the policy part of what you're describing as a policy structure in terms of reducing, lowering things over time, tightening up standards, and you can build that into a policy, but I can talk about that in more detail.
Well, this has
You
been
can't change the policy itself because you want to know what to expect.
This has been a fascinating topic. I think John has a last word he wants to say.
Yeah, I just wanted to wrap up quickly, and this has been an excellent presentation.
Yes.
All of you,
Yes, yes.
Most really where we're at, I think, is we have our feet in reality with the metrics. The attention to metrics is so essential here in knowing how we map our future. It's the strategy that needs adjustment now, and some radical adjustment if we're to meet the emissions goals. And it reminds me that I saw a dramatic demonstration of something dramatic. And it was, I visited Paris the week before the Paris Accords. There was no traffic. Paris was having a no-car day. The only cars on those boulevards and big streets were taxis and buses. And pretty soon in the middle of the day, you have whole families out there bicycling on these empty streets. So, as a people, we're capable of great things, and we should not underestimate what we can do. And again, I thank you very much. This is extremely informative, and it's really what we needed now.
Yes, again, thank you.
It would have been good if she knew what the city's policy is.
Well, she's new though.
So folks, if you
I mean, you know, that's what she
I think I'm
said.
gonna send,
we
had an OSE person named Christy Baumel come and explain the climate policy about 5 years ago, and I have that on video. And she just totally stumbled over everything. And if you look at it, it will say, we are protecting trees and we have a goal to increase the canopy. And of course,
I told you
we're
there's nothing in that report because I looked at it and said, trying to find where's the tree policy in this climate policy. It was not there. They never consulted the urban forestry commissions. I've been to almost every meeting. Nobody ever came to say, here's the climate policy. What should our input be on trees? They just ignored it.
they did
They went to transportation and stuff that did not cover trees.
that UW guy did say that it has nothing, but then you brought up Heat Island, and he isn't an expert on Heat Island. But I would like to see the studies that there are. He says there's hardly any information. I want to see that data.
Well, the disturbing thing is the issue of trees along streets and the canyons